Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're really plunging into the story of the ancient Library of Alexandria.
Yeah, it's one of those topics, isn't it? Shrouded in myth and a lot of romantic ideas.
Totally. And we've got some interesting sources to help us pick it apart. There's a general history piece on famous figures, a Reddit thread questioning the whole burning tragedy,
Oh, sounds
and
intriguing.
a scholarly blog post that aims to debunk some common misconceptions.
Right. So our mission basically is to try and separate the fact from the fiction for you.
Exactly. Because that popular image is so strong, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. This single catastrophic fire wiping out all knowledge, setting humanity back centuries, it's dramatic.
It makes for a great story. But does it actually hold up? That's what we need to figure out based on these sources.
Precisely. Does that dramatic narrative stand up to historical scrutiny?
Okay, so let's start there. Initial understanding versus reality. That Reddit thread you mentioned, its title alone kind of throws down the gauntlet.
It does. It calls the tragedy of the library, burning down and setting knowledge back centuries, a myth.
A myth, right off the bat. Instead, it suggests
What?
a slower decline.
Yeah, exactly. A slow fade over many, many years. And it also points out something important. Alexandria wasn't the only major library.
Ah, okay, so other places had similar collections.
Often, yes. Other big centers had libraries, and many housed copies of the same works. So the idea of this one single point of failure maybe doesn't quite fit.
Gotcha. Okay, and then the ThoughtCo article lists some pretty big names associated with the library.
Yeah, kind of who's who.
Right, like Eratosthenes, maybe Ptolemy, Euclid, Herophilos, Dionysius of Thrace.
Impressive list.
It even mentions possible links to Hipparchus and Archimedes, though it says those are less certain. And it specifically rules out Hypatia, saying the library was gone by her time.
That clarification about Hypatia is important.
So who were these people? And what were they actually doing there? How solid are these connections according to our other sources?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. That list is impressive, but the History for Atheists blog is a bit more cautious.
How so?
It argues that while ThoughtCo lists them, the actual proof of them being, say, employed there or doing sustained work in the library is often, well, lacking.
Okay. So maybe they visited or studied nearby, but weren't necessarily staff?
Sort of. Eratosthenes seems to be the strongest link, definitely connected with scientific work there. Euclid and Herophilos, maybe. It depends partly on when the Mautian was fully established.
The Mautian? Remind us what that was again?
Right. The Mautian was like a research institute closely connected to the library. Think of it as the scholarly engine room. The library was the collection. The Mautian was where many scholars worked.
Got it. So Euclid and Herophilos might have been associated with the Mautian, and by extension, the library?
Possibly. Dionysius of Thrace is another possibility mentioned in the blog, but again, not nailed down.
So the image of all these scientific heavyweights constantly buzzing around the library itself might be stretching it a bit.
That's what the blog suggests, yes. It argues the library's reputation as this massive scientific hub has been perhaps inflated.
Why? Any ideas from the sources?
Well, the blog points to things like Carl Sagan's Cosmos or the movie Agora, hugely influential, compelling narratives.
Second.
But the blog argues they sometimes pushed a romanticized view, maybe simplifying the history to fit a narrative about, say, secular reason versus mysticism.
Okay, so maybe sacrificing some historical nuance for a good story.
Possibly. It's a complex issue.
Right. Let's really dig into this myth of the burning then. The Reddit thread seems pretty clear it wasn't this one big fire.
Absolutely. It frames it as a gradual fading, not a sudden dramatic end.
And that lines up with the Quintus Curtius blog post too, right?
Yes, very much so. That post argues for a slow decay caused by, and I quote, neglect, apathy, and negligence over generations. Not a single blaze.
Neglect and apathy, that's less dramatic, but maybe more realistic.
It often is, isn't it? The post even mentions the historian Edward Gibbon, who believed the collection was already seriously diminished long before 391 AD, a date often linked to destruction.
And the History for Atheists blog goes even further, particularly about the story involving a Christian mob.
Oh yeah, it's very direct. It tackles that narrative head-on, the one that became popular, especially in some new atheist circles. The blog's verdict is blunt. It never happened.
Wow. Okay. So it tries to debunk these specific claims.
Systematically. It looks at the alleged causes, including the Christian zealots, and argues there's just no reliable historical evidence connecting them to the destruction of the main Great Library.
And the Esoterica transcript adds to this skepticism.
It does. It talks about the silence of historical evidence surrounding the library's fate. It suggests we tend to fill those gaps with assumptions, leading to what it calls history hallucination.
History hallucination, I like that. Creating stories where the facts just aren't there.
Exactly. So that powerful image, flames, mobs, lost knowledge, it just doesn't seem to be supported by the evidence we actually have for the main library.
Okay, so if it wasn't one big dramatic fire that wiped everything out, what did happen? What reasons do our sources give for the decline and the loss of all those texts?
Well, several sources point to a more complex and maybe less exciting reality.
Like the neglect and apathy mentioned earlier?
Exactly. The Quintus Curtius blog emphasizes that slow rot, and the Reddit thread broadens that out. It talks about the loss of ancient texts being a much bigger problem tied to culture and economics.
How so?
Think about the basics. Scrolls were written on papyrus, right?
Right.
Papyrus isn't exactly archival quality paper. It degrades. So you need good storage, which wasn't always available. You need the right environment. Humidity is bad news.
And Alexandria is pretty humid, isn't it? Near the sea.
Very. The Esoterica transcript makes that exact point. Papyrus survives best in dry desert conditions, which is where many fragments have been found. Alexandria's climate, not ideal.
Okay, so the material itself was fragile. What else?
Just keeping texts alive required constant effort. The Esoterica transcript highlights this. Constant copying, correcting mistakes that inevitably creep in. Physical repairs.
That sounds expensive and time-consuming.
It was. It needed ongoing community support, political stability, and money. If interest waned, or funding dried up, or there was instability...
The copying might stop.
Yeah.
And the existing scrolls would just decay.
Pretty much. The Reddit thread also mentions that survival often depended on whether a text became part of that, standard school curriculum, or if medieval scribes later decided it was important enough to copy.
So it's kind of random what survived.
In some ways, yes. The Reddit thread gives the example of Greek plays. Many were lost within a century simply because they weren't continuously valued and copied.
That paints a very different picture. Not a fortress of knowledge, but a fragile ecosystem needing constant care.
I think that's a really good way to put it.
Okay, let's talk size then. That number you hear all the time, 500,000 scrolls. Is there any truth to that?
Ugh, the big number. Well, the History for Atheists blog tackles this directly. It calls the reliability of that figure into question.
How?
It actually shows a table with estimates from different ancient authors, and they're all over the place. Aristeas suggests maybe 200,000 to 500,000, but then others like Aulus Gellius and Ammianus Marcellinus claim 700,000.
Wow, that's a huge range. How could they even count back then?
Exactly the point the blog makes. They didn't have modern inventory systems. These numbers are likely very rough estimates, maybe boasts, perhaps even, as the blog suggests, probable fantasies.
Fantasies. Okay, so that romantic image of endless shelves holding 500,000 scrolls, probably not accurate.
Seems unlikely based on more sober analysis. The blog brings in a modern scholar, Roger Bagnall, who did a calculation based on the number of known authors from that early Hellenistic period.
And what did he come up with?
Around 31,250 scrolls.
31,000. That's a lot less than 500,000.
It really is. Bagnall argues that to get to those huge numbers, you'd have to assume vast numbers of authors whose names are completely lost to us, or that the library held tons of duplicate copies of everything. Both seem a bit improbable.
Okay, that makes sense. Does the blog offer any comparisons?
Yes, and that's really helpful context. It mentions estimates for other big ancient libraries, like the one at the Forum of Trajan in Rome, maybe 20,000 scrolls, or Pergamon, around 30,000.
So compared to those, Alexandria was likely the biggest.
Probably, yes. The blog suggests maybe peaking around 40,000 to 50,000 scrolls. Still the largest known, a major collection, but not the almost mythical numbers often quoted.
And the Esoterica transcript backs this up too.
It does, from a practical angle. It points out the sheer physical difficulty of storing hundreds of thousands of scrolls in buildings comparable in size to libraries we can excavate, like Ephesus or Pergamum. Even being generous about scroll size and writing density, those massive numbers seem physically unlikely.
Right. Space limitations.
Mm-hmm.
And the Reddit thread had a point about the type of text too.
Yeah, a reminder that it was founded around 300 BCE, primarily collecting Greek texts for a Greek-speaking scholarly community under the Ptolemies. Later, there were some translations Egyptian, Chaldean, Roman, but the core was Hellenistic Greek literature and scholarship.
Okay, so big, important, focus on Greek learning, but maybe not 500,000 scrolls covering everything imaginable.
That seems to be the picture emerging from these sources.
Which leads us to another popular idea, the library as this powerhouse of science and technology, an ancient MIT almost.
Right. And the History for Atheists blog challenges that image too.
Again, okay, how?
It points out that, going back to those famous names, only Eratosthenes really has a strong confirmed link to doing scientific work at the library or Mausian complex.
Only Eratosthenes. What about the others, like Euclid or Ptolemy?
Ptolemy the astronomer is mentioned as a possibility by the blog, but not certain. Euclid may be associated with the Mausians' early days, but the blog argues that the idea of it being this constant hotbed of scientific speculation and discovery is likely another exaggeration.
So what was the main focus, if not science, as we think of it?
According to the blog, the scholars at the Mausian were primarily focused on things like literary analysis, textual criticism, comparing different versions of Homer, for example, poetry, grammar, important scholarly work, but not necessarily science or technology development in our modern sense.
So more like humanities research.
Largely, yes. The blog explains that Greek proto-science or natural philosophy was often quite abstract and philosophical. Lots of observation and logical deduction, but less emphasis on, say, controlled experiments or empirical measurement compared to modern science.
Okay, so thinking about the elements earth, air, fire, water, rather than building machines necessarily.
Generally speaking, yes. Which connects to another point the blog makes, debunking the idea that the library's destruction somehow set back technological progress by 1,000 years.
Right, I've heard that one too. Like they had blueprints for steam engines lost in the fire.
Exactly that kind of idea. The blog calls it a fantasy. It argues that Greek natural philosophy was often quite separate from the practical arts and crafts.
So the philosophers weren't necessarily hanging out with the engineers.
Not usually, no. The blog uses Hero of Alexandria's Aeolipile as an example, often cited as an early steam engine. But it was likely more of a curiosity, a demonstration piece, maybe even a temple device, not a practical power source for industry.
A cool toy, not a locomotive.
Pretty much. And the Antikythera mechanism, that amazing astronomical calculator,
Yeah,
also mentioned by the blog as being unrelated to the library and significantly predating the rise of Christianity by centuries, countering narratives that try to link its loss to later events.
so the idea of lost inventions and a stalled industrial revolution because of the library's end doesn't really fit the evidence.
Doesn't seem to, based on this analysis. The connection between the kind of scholarship done there and practical technology wasn't as direct as we might imagine.
Okay, so the narrative of a single fire seems unlikely, the size was probably exaggerated, and the focus wasn't solely on science and tech. What about these multiple destructions or different library sites?
Right, because it wasn't necessarily just one building or one event. The History for Atheists blog brings up Julius Caesar's siege of Alexandria in 47 BC.
That's often mentioned, isn't it? The fire during his conflict with Pompey's forces?
Yes, the blog cites the historian Plutarch, writing much later, who does mention fire spreading and affecting the Great Library. However, it also notes that Caesar himself, in his own account of the Alexandrian War, doesn't mention burning the library.
Interesting omission. So maybe some damage, but total destruction. Unclear.
Seems that way. Then the blog discusses the Serapeum.
What was the Serapeum?
It was a major temple complex in Alexandria dedicated to the god Serapis, and it seems to have housed a significant library collection, sometimes called a daughter library, to the main Great Library.
Okay, and what happened to it?
This is where we have a well-documented destruction event. In 391 AD, Roman soldiers, encouraged by the Christian patriarch Theophilus, tore down the temple and likely dispersed or destroyed any library collections still housed there.
Ah, so there was a destruction involving Christians, but it was the Serapeum Library, not the original Great Library.
That's what the blog argues is the most plausible scenario. It suggests that this event in 391 AD is probably the seed of the myth, the historical kernel that got conflated over time with the Great Library, which the blog argues had likely already ceased to exist in its grand form by then.
So the story elements got mixed up over centuries.
It seems likely. The blog mentions Ammianus Marcellinus, a Roman historian who wrote a bit before 391. He talks about libraries in Alexandria and mentions both Caesar's fire and a library containing 700,000 books, that huge number again.
Right.
But the blog points out that when Ammianus describes the Serapeum itself, which you probably saw, he refers to its libraries in the past tense, suggesting they might have already been gone by the time the temple was demolished.
Subtle but important distinction. And the Reddit thread, because it mentioned these different events.
Yes, it mentions the fire in 47 BCE with Caesar and acknowledges there might have been other moments of destruction later on. It also makes the crucial point that Caesar's intervention effectively ended the long rule of the Ptolemaic dynasty.
Who were the original founders and patrons of the library?
Exactly. So, losing their patronage would have been a massive blow, likely contributing to that long, slow decline long before the Serapeum event. It wasn't just one thing, but a complex series of events and factors.
Okay. And very briefly, did any sources mention how the library was, like, organized? Did they have librarians and catalogs?
There's a tantalizing hint in the Stack Exchange answer we looked at. It mentions a Greek phrase, Penakaston en pas padea de alamsanton.
Which means?
Roughly, tables of those who shone in all education. This might refer to lists of famous scholars associated with the library, or potentially even a form of catalog of the holdings, perhaps organized by subject or author.
Maybe created by someone like Callimachus, a famous scholar-poet associated with the library.
Possibly. Callimachus is often credited with creating the Panicis. But the frustrating thing is, the source itself doesn't give much more concrete detail. We don't have surviving copies of these detailed catalogs if they existed in the way we imagine them.
So another area where the details are kind of fuzzy.
Very much so. The nature of the surviving evidence just doesn't give us that level of operational detail.
Right. So bringing this all together then, wrapping up our deep dive, it seems the classic story, one big fire, 500,000 scrolls, lost science, is, well, mostly myth.
That seems to be the strong consensus from these varied sources, yes. The picture that emerges is far more nuanced.
A gradual decline seems much more likely,
Yeah.
driven by things like neglect, changing cultural priorities, economic factors, the sheer difficulty of preserving papyrus.
Rather than a single dramatic moment of destruction. And while it was certainly a major, hugely important center of learning for the ancient world,
Its size was probably smaller than the legends claim, maybe more in the tens of thousands of scrolls, not hundreds of thousands.
right, still massive for its time, likely the biggest, but not unimaginably vast. And its focus was perhaps more on literary scholarship, textual criticism, grammar, the humanities, than on science and technology as we define them today.
And multiple events likely played a part in its demise. Caesar's fire might have caused damage, the loss of Ptolemaic patronage was key, and the later destruction of the Serapeum Library in 391 AD probably got conflated with the fate of the original Great Library, seeding that enduring myth.
Exactly. The Serapeum event seems crucial to understanding how the story of the library's destruction evolved.
So it makes you think, doesn't it? If this incredibly famous story is so layered with myth and misunderstanding, what else that we think we know about history might be more complicated?
That's a really powerful takeaway, how easily dramatic narratives can take hold, sometimes obscuring a more complex, maybe less sensational truth.
Maybe the real tragedy wasn't a single fire, but something quieter. That slow fading of knowledge when a society stops actively valuing it, stops investing in preserving and copying it.
That's a sobering thought, and it feels incredibly relevant today, doesn't it? In our own digital age, with information overload and questions about long-term digital preservation.
Absolutely. So perhaps something for you, the listener, to ponder. What other historical facts might deserve a second look? And are we doing enough to ensure the knowledge we value today truly endures for future generations?
It encourages that critical look at the stories we tell ourselves about the past, and always, always digging into the evidence.